Thank you everyone for joining us for today's webinar on the BIOSECURE Act, a really hot topic for biotech startups these days. I'm proud to co-present this webinar with the Society of Physician Entrepreneurs. I'll tell you a little bit about the GW Technology Commercialization Office before we jump in. Our team is working tirelessly to work with entrepreneurs to transform inventions from GW into innovations that can impact our marketplace and our society and our health well-being. So anybody on our team would be happy to discuss how we could work together with those of you who are experienced entrepreneurs and those of you who want to learn more about the exciting research going on at GW. So please feel free to email or call us and reach out on LinkedIn any way that you like. Want to share a couple of the ways that we support our startups and technologies, both before and after licensing. So on the front side, we do help de-risk technologies with promising impact in two ways, through our innovation competition and through our technology maturation awards. We gave out $200,000 to technologies that were early stage to help bring them to the next level. Get experiments done that can't necessarily be done through grant funding and make them more attractive to licensees. And these include impact on diabetic kidney disease, on the opioid crisis this year, and on tackling bacterial infections. So it's really a wide array of applications and things that we're excited to move forward here at GW. We also have support for our startups after the licensing deal goes through, and this takes goes through two processes. One is through funding support through additional internal research funds. So we match SBIR funds, and we're hoping to give out our first award next month. We also provide opportunities for pitching in front of investors. We partner twice a year with Connectpreneur here in the DC area, and we partner with Pismo Ventures once a year for their life science startup symposium. We just had that over the last 2 weeks and had some 100-odd companies apply to pitch, and the top couple dozen pitched to a large number of investors last week. Really great opportunity to get in front of investors, get that chance to start raising funds. And I want to invite everybody to an event this fall where we're going to be bringing in program directors from multiple different SBIR groups in the federal government, from NIH to ARPA-H and NSF. So you can get one-on-one FaceTime in front of them. They're really excited to help individual companies to put their best foot forward and get this funding so they can spur economic development and bring technologies forward in this country. And with that, I would like to introduce Jeff Hausfeld, our moderator, co-founder of the Society of Physician Entrepreneurs, to kick off our webinar on the BIOSECURE Act.
Thank you, Brian. As always, a pleasure to co-host a webinar with GW. Today, we're going to talk about a very interesting topic, the BIOSECURE Act. So this is something that is important for all of us in the biopharmaceutical space. For my company, BioVectura, specifically, because we are working on a government contract for the research, development, and manufacture of a smallpox therapeutic as a medical countermeasure for a potential bioterrorist attack. So it has significant ramifications for BioVectura, as well as many other companies in the biopharmaceutical space, and perhaps throughout the life science industry. We have two terrific speakers today. Jin Zhang, who is a partner in LDV Partners, a venture capital firm. Jin is a physician-trained financier now, and is one of the leaders of our Society of Physician Entrepreneur chapters in San Francisco. Welcome, Ching. And we have Lindsay Nelson, who is one of our speakers from Jones Day, an attorney here in Washington, D.C., who is our subject matter expert on all things about international law and how this will affect each of us in our companies. Let me start by reading you a little quick article about the BIOSECURE Act so that you have some background in terms of what we're talking about. This came out about a week and a half ago in Endpoints. And Zachary Brennan is the author, and he says, a bill that would effectively force dozens of biopharma companies to cut ties with WuXi AppTec and 4 other Chinese biotech suppliers by 2032 advanced with bipartisan support in the House Oversight Committee on Wednesday. It was a 40-1 positive vote, a key step forward for a closely watched bill that has a short timeline to cross the finish line. Both the House and Senate bills are now awaiting floor votes. Under the House version of the bill, almost all biopharmaceutical companies doing business in the U.S. would have until 2032, which may sound like a long time, but really isn't, to transition away from 5 Chinese companies in the bill. That includes BGI, WuXi AppTec, WuXi Biologics, and the latter of which has been added to the most recently updated version of the House bill from May 13th. Oversight Chair James Comer and bill co-sponsor Raja Krishnamurthy alleged during the markup that WuXi and BGI have partnered with the Chinese government on genetic testing centers targeting the Uyghur population. We are specifically naming those companies. First, BGI and WuXi have been found to be involved in the perpetration of human rights abuses, specifically the Uyghur genocide. Comer also said that WuXi has reported that stolen intellectual property shared with the Chinese government. Reuters reported in March that WuXi shared a client's IP with the Chinese government without permission, according to 2 sources. They can't get into the classified reports, but there are also other reports of them stealing IP. A WuXi AppTec person disputed the allegation, saying the company does not have a human genomics business. They're not involved in any genetic collection or testing of any ethnic group, neither in Xinjiang or elsewhere. They were not aware, never approved, and does not condone and have a zero tolerance policy against any attempt to mishandle or transfer a customer's intellectual property to any unauthorized party. And neither the U.S. government or any customer has brought any such allegation to WuXi's attention. They have not been provided any supporting evidence regarding such an allegation. So that's the context of what we're dealing with here. And now I'd like to ask Lindsay if she can give us a little bit more granular look at what the BIOSECURE Act means to this industry, to the biopharmaceutical industry, and to the life science sector as a whole. Lindsay, the floor is yours.
Sounds great. And let me share my screen. Let's see. Okay. Is everyone seeing that?
You're good.
Okay. So again, thanks for having me, everyone. Looking forward to talk about this very hot topic. I was actually in Shanghai back in March, right after the bill was approved through the Senate committee, and gave a presentation there to a number of Chinese companies who have kind of concerns on the different side of this, with the idea of potentially being targeted here, but also because a lot of the companies have both US and Chinese connections, understanding how it could affect their US business as well. So as Dr. Hosfield said, the BIOSECURE Act is still in Congress. It is not yet law. We do not know exactly what it will look like when it becomes law. There was one version that was advanced out of the Senate, 11-1 in March. And then, as Dr. Hosfield said, another version came out of the House Oversight Committee just a couple of weeks ago, 40-1. So they are pending in front of both House chambers. We do not yet know when they will go up for a vote. One of the issues that will need to be dealt with is there are some differences between the Senate version and the House version that will need to be reconciled. And so everything that we're talking about on this conversation, it's still a bit up in the air because the final legislation could look like the Senate version, it could look like the House version, it could be some combination, they could add in something new in the negotiation. So we're still waiting to see what the actual bill would look like. Of course, then it would need to be signed by the president to become law. But I think one of the few things that Congress has been agreeing on lately is putting in place laws and regulations that affect China and that try to encourage U.S. companies to divest or cut ties with Chinese counterparties. So seems likely that if it gets passed through the House and the Senate, that it will be signed by the president. So the BIOSECURE Act is actually a government contracting provision. This is something that the US government has been doing the last couple of years in order to influence the activities of US companies. It can be difficult for them to impose a law that says, US companies, you can't do business with XYZ company without it being kind of a really aggressive move. And so what they have been doing instead is that they've essentially said, no government funds will be used if you are using such, if you're working with such counterparties. So this was used a couple years ago in connection with certain telecommunications equipment providers coming out of China, where the government the US government passed a law that put into place a federal acquisition regulation that was inserted into every federal government contract that essentially said if you engage in certain activities with these Chinese telecommunications providers, you can't enter into this contract with us, or you will be in violation of the contract. And you could be penalized even for under the False Claims Act if you are not in compliance. So that's the tack that they're taking to try to essentially impose a policy goal with regard to who US companies interact with. So the actual text of this, and I've mostly pulled the text from the more recent House bill, and we'll talk at the end about some of the differences between the two that need to be negotiated. But it essentially prohibits the head of an executive agency from procuring or obtaining biotech equipment or service provided or produced or provided by a biotechnology company of concern. Now, those are those companies that Dr. Housefield mentioned earlier that I'll discuss again. So this is pretty straightforward. The government cannot directly contract with those companies, or they can't, for example, for equipment, a US government contractor couldn't obtain equipment from one of these companies and then pass it along to the US government as part of a government contract. Then the broader restriction here is they can't enter into a contract or extend or renew a contract with an entity that uses biotech equipment or services produced or provided by a biotech company of concern and acquired after the applicable effective date. So if in the process of fulfilling the contract, there is any use of equipment or services from a company of concern, that would be prohibited under the FAR provision. Or the entry into a contract where the performance where the contractor or the government knows or has reason to believe that the performance of the contract would require the use of biotechnology equipment or services produced or provided by a biotech company of concern. This is a list of current biotechnology companies of concerns. WuXi Biologics is actually only in the House bill. It's not in the Senate bill. But it may actually have been captured anyway, because you can see that one of the categories is subsidiaries, parent affiliates, or successors of the named entities. And I'll also note here, obviously, there's been a lot of focus on these named companies, but there could be additional companies that are added to this. Essentially, the government has the authority to add to this list any entity that is subject to the administrative governance structure, direction, or control, or operates on behalf of a government of a foreign adversary, is involved in the manufacturing, distribution, provision, or procurement of biotechnology equipment or services, and poses a risk to the national security of the United States based on certain factors. So right now, this is the list. This could change by the time the bill comes out, and it could change after the bill comes out, where additional companies are added to this list of biotechnology companies of concern. Now, I will say, in the context of that telecommunications restrictions that I talked about before, there was similar language in that provision, and a lot of folks expected that it may expand significantly beyond the initial list that was provided in that bill. It really hasn't. There hasn't been a significant expansion of that. So it's unclear how much the government will use this to add other companies to the list, or if this will mainly stay the focus of the restrictions. I will note there is a waiver authority. So the heads of the various executive agencies that are entering into procurement may waive the prohibition on a case-by-case basis. They do have to obtain certain approvals and make certain notifications, but there is that possibility. So this isn't, it's a strict prohibition, but there is essentially, to the extent that you have a good case as to why you can't comply with the provision because of the way your systems are set up, there is the potential to obtain a waiver. Again, we don't know how aggressively that will be used, how many people will go in to try to get it, how willing they will be to give such waivers. That's really one of those things that will be very up in the air. So I've noted here some of the differences between the House and the Senate bill that are still subject to negotiation. So the House bill essentially grandfathers in contracts, including option years, which I think is pretty important because a lot of times these restrictions say if you have a contract with option years, once the initial contract is over, you can't take advantage of those option years. But this one does include option years where the contract was entered into before the act is effective and running through January 1st, 2032. So we want to make clear that this isn't the idea that someone could, let's assume this gets passed and this is a provision in it. A company couldn't enter into a contract with one of the biotechnology companies of concern a year from now, even if it will end by 2031, because the contract has to already be in place. And so it's intending to not make it such that there can be an expansion before there's a contraction of business. It's the idea that whatever is in place now will allow you to continue that through 2032. The House bill also provides language that says biotechnology equipment or services produced or provided by a biotechnology company of concern does not include biotechnology equipment or services that were formerly but are no longer produced or provided by biotechnology companies of concern. Frankly, the reading of this, I've read a bunch of articles about this, and everyone kind of repeats it. I don't really know what they are intending to remove from this with this provision. So I will see how they play out, what exactly this is intended to cover. But this is a difference between the two bills. So we'll see how it ends up. A key part of the last one of the last differences is that the Senate bill actually doesn't define contract. It doesn't really say the extent of government contracts or grants or funding that this applies to, whereas the House bill does specifically define contract as a contract that is subject to the federal acquisition regulations. And so those are the way that is defined specifically excludes Medicaid rebate agreements and Medicare discount agreements. And so this would be the idea that, yes, if you enter into a direct grant with the US government or a direct contract to do research or provide certain pharmaceuticals outside of Medicare or Medicaid, that is going to be covered. But to the extent that the only connection between the business of the company and the government is the inclusion of a medicine on with regard to Medicaid and Medicare, that those would not be covered for these purposes. So before we kick it over to the other speakers, I will note that there's just a few considerations that companies should take into account while we're still waiting to see what the passed bill actually looks like, because that's when we're really going to know the facts here as to how companies need to move forward. So one is reviewing the current and future business of the company to determine if it is going to be subject to the restrictions. I understand in the industry, most companies are going to have some type of connection to the U.S. government, receive some kind of funding, enter into government contracts, as Dr. Hosfield was talking about, and those will be affected. But to the extent that you have a company that does not contract with the U.S. federal government, this prohibition won't apply because it doesn't get swept in within the jurisdiction of how this is going to apply. And so really one thing is looking at, is this actually even going to apply to me? Because I think a lot of press out there has been like, oh, US companies can no longer do business with these, 5 biotech companies, which is, it's a bit oversimplified and overexpansive as to what it actually covers. And so it's important to understand, will it actually affect my company based on our current business and what we would like our business to be, 5-10 years from now. Then it's understanding your supply chain, your contracting partners, to understand if in your supply chain you have any of these biotechnology companies of concerns, and understanding how it could affect you right now. And then also thinking about who could be added in the future and how that could have an effect. So there is essentially the whole point of this is the US government wants US companies to diversify their supply chain with regard to biotechnology, particularly out of China. Right now, that when I talked about earlier, if you're the definition of who can become a biotechnology company of concern is when you have certain control or other activities relating to a foreign adversary government. Currently, that list is China, North Korea, Russia, Iran. Not many US companies, for mostly sanctions reasons and otherwise, are not currently engaging in much activity with North Korea, Russia, or Iran in this particular area. So this really is, in a lot of ways, a China bill. And so it's just making sure that you're looking at your supply chain, and if you may be affected, understanding that there is risk that additional companies in China could be added to the list. And that's really the intent of the US government here, is to have folks look outside of China to perform some of those CDMO services that a lot of companies go to China for right now. So that is all I have. So I will turn it over to Chang.
So before we turn it over, I have a quick question for you, Lindsay.
Yep.
So what you basically said is that if you're not under a current government contract, you wouldn't be subject to this regulation. Is that correct?
Correct. Or if you enter into a government contract in the future, you will be subject to this regulation. So if you do not have government contracts, you will not be subject to this regulation.
So what happens with companies that have a CRADA? What happens with companies that have in-license from the DoD or from NIH, or that have received SBIRs or STTRs in the initial stages of their formation, but have now gone to other sources of funding, but still may have some tie to the intellectual property of that asset from a government agency?
Yeah, to the extent that the grant or funding is continuing, then that would still apply. To the extent that you have something that was kind of formerly, started using government funding, but is no longer subject to a government contract, I don't see anything in the proposed legislation that would cover that, just because the U.S. government may have some intellectual property rights in the item as a result of R&D funds being provided. But I think that is going to be one of those things that, so whenever a law is passed, it will say a lot of things, but how it gets implemented is through regulations. And so part of this will be, sometimes you'll see the broad strokes of the law, and then it becomes, once it's actually implemented in a regulation, can have some slight differences, potential expansions or contractions. And so I think we'll need to see what the regulations actually look like here. But based on the legislation, I don't see anything that says, because you received funding at first, that if that funding has stopped, that there is a continuing obligation with regard to, products that were supported by government R&D.
Good. I'm sure that many companies are having a sigh of relief at the moment. Chin,
yeah. Again, don't want to say it could be come out and be interpreted differently,
yeah.
but that's my current interpretation of the legislation.
Thank you, Lindsay. That was great. Chin, you have a unique perspective in terms of being a physician and now a part of a venture capital firm, but with significant ties to Asia, and you've recently visited there. Please share your viewpoint, your perspectives, and what you think this bill means.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Hausfeld, and thank you, Lindsay, for the great sharing of your great expertise in the space. So I would say from our perspective, I would probably address more about what it means for startups, especially when they are continuing to run their company, how much potential disruption will this cost them? I agree, it was such a big relief, like to hear more about the details, and also it's still pending the air. So I don't see any reason to be panicking about things at this moment. But I do want to address like about 5 key points that I would kind of summarize here. I also had the pleasure and honor to invite a friend who is dialing in from the audience today to share with some real world practice in APAC regions. So about the 5 points I would love to talk a bit more about is from a startup like biotech, when we're raising capital, we as investors, we are aligned with the goals of the company. We want to be, capital efficient. We care about ROI. We do care a lot about who you work with in terms of efficiency and price and your cost. So that is number one. And the second point is this act definitely will require companies to do more market research and to do more vendor selection in a way that to balance the cost and benefit and the potential headline risk that they might face. Because if you enter into phase 1, 2, and then switch, that might be a big disruption. But if you're still in early stage, it's probably okay, especially if you're not under any contract with, as mentioned earlier, like DoD. And the third point is about strategy for the companies and when do you make changes? When do you have plan Bs, and who do you work with, and what assets or what programs do you actually spend time on? And I would highly recommend bring this to the board and really build a constructive board governance and discuss with them, to align everything. It's not one single decision, right? And it's all about cash flow management. What milestones to achieve, how do you plan your timeline in case there might be significant delays because you have to switch. I did a very rough market research, like polling from some of the biotechs that I know of and I respect, like what are their best to-dos, that experience they can share. As a little bit more general rule is because we have a 2032 timeline, there actually is some time for people to prepare. And for very early stage R&D projects, there seems to be less of urgency or less concern. I think for pre-IND stage and to phase 1 assets, there's a bit more concern that people kind of have a plan B or at least something cooking at the same time, at least for the second asset in the pipeline. Right, so I think these are a few key points that I see coming up from the real world practice. I would love to invite Emmanuel. Emmanuel, if you could unmute yourself and then probably do a self intro. And Emmanuel, he's a background in life science and trained as an investor, and then spend a lot of time in the APAC regions and building the local ecosystem, and has real world practices interfacing with a lot of inbound inquiries about this particular topic. So that's why I invited him on board to share with us his insights and case stories of what he has seen and is seeing happening. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Ching. Am I on? I'm not sure.
Yeah,
oh, okay, got it. Yeah, I got calling in from Hong Kong. It's a 12:30 a.m. Good evening, everybody. But thank you. My name is Emmanuel Hui. I run an accelerator in Hong Kong that particularly helps US startups to land in Asia and also to help Chinese companies to go abroad. And so, this BIOSECURE Act is something that we're quite deliberate about how do we de-risk our assets and how do we position ourselves so that we are all the companies that we support and invest in, some of which I've co-invested in with Ching as well. How do we make sure that these companies can continue to operate smoothly and continue to pursue, the Asian markets, especially China, which you can't ignore as the second largest market in the world. And also, how do you continue to utilize, Chinese efforts? The CDMO, CMC, CRO, as Ching said, doing that work in China is often much more capital efficient than doing it anywhere else. So how do we continue to pursue the Chinese market while staying within the lines of the new rules being in place? And I think to start, I can use our own example. Our own accelerator is owned 30% by TigerMed, which is the largest clinical CRO in China at the moment. And TigerMed, as a clinical CRO, only deals with desensitized data. And we are very cognizant about providing and outsourcing services for clinical trials. And we, in order to make sure that all of our clients and all of our projects are continue, we actually have a lot of partnerships abroad. And so we have clients that, for example, enter contracts with Cerba, which is, based in France and Belgium. And then through there, they then work with our colleagues in Suzhou in China to continue the work that needs to be done. And so that contract at that level is not directly with TigerMed or not directly with a Chinese entity, although there should be no problem. There is no problem, as we are not one of the companies that are of concern. And also, we have operations that are independent in the US and operating as well as a minority stake as well in other companies. For example, we have a company called Opera, which is a CRO in Western Europe that started 29 years ago, and we are an investor in them, and they're now headquartered in Romania. And so instead of directly contracting with a company can consider contracting with Opera instead, and still be able to very cleanly operate without having to any disruption to their operations. And so these are just, being overly cautious, I think, at the moment, and how we are looking ahead and planning all of our early stage projects that, as you say, that date that's oncoming, it's not that far away concerning how long drug development cycles last. And so, and so what we're seeing on the ground is that no need really for us to be overly concerned. But just to be extra safe, we are taking particular interest in setting up offshore structures, making sure that Cayman is holding your Hong Kong or your Asia subsidiaries, and to make sure that that our stake in our investments continues to be a minority and non-controlling stake. I think unlike some of the companies listed, which integrate a lot of that internally, a lot of their services after they acquire assets and continue to do things in-house, whereas we are very much focused on partner with global partners and making sure that we are not majority overly controlling any aspect of any the supply chain. So that's how we're seeing it here. And and my team is also dialed in as well from the TigerMed US team. But that's how we're seeing it, and I'm looking forward to see how we can continue to make things easier and better for all, because diseases know no borders, and that's what I'm focused on. I just really focus on making the best drugs to help everybody wherever they are. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Emmanuel. So, Emmanuel, let me just ask you, what is your take on this? On the bill's basic saying that this is a national security risk, that these companies have ties to the Chinese Communist Party, They're part of the PRC military companies, that they're transferring genetic data of American citizens, if there are CRO, but they're owned by one of these companies, to the Chinese government. That's the allegation. So help us understand where that's coming from.
I don't know. I haven't read those allegations. I don't know what's I know what those other companies have been doing, so I can't speak for on their behalf. But I think there is a little bit of over so for example, Shanghai has a number of hospitals that are #2 or #3 military hospital, or the Navy whatever hospital, right? Those are legacy names. Those are just names. The hospitals are named, whatever military hospital. They're not actually military at all. They're civilian. It's just historically they were first established because there was the military base there. And therefore, but moving forward, there is literally zero military activity in that hospital, and it's just serving your local grandma selling vegetables in the market, and they're just going for their regular daily care. And so there's a degree of that where it seems a little bit far-fetched and a little bit ridiculous from our perspective, where they're saying, oh, that also counts as a, so maybe it's a misnomer on the Chinese side. Maybe they should have named things better. Maybe they should have really changed. I don't know. But and I think overall, is there legitimacy to the concern that data should be more properly governed? I think both governments, China and U.S. governments, are very concerned about their national their people's data being transferred to either side. I mean, with TikTok and everything, it's a common thread, and not just between these two countries, but between all countries. And so I think we're in a phase now where it's not really particularly just about geopolitics, but what is good data governance for everybody moving forward? What is appropriate in terms of managing clinical trial data? And how do we continue to do multi-regional clinical trials and continue to submit data to multiple regulatory agencies while making sure that we maintain the dignity and respect of human data? So these things are, I think the whole world is still trying to figure this out at the moment, and I think we just have to continue to practice best practices and make sure that yes, as a clinical CRO, just TigerMed, make sure that everything is desensitized. We don't have any of our patients' data. Nothing can be viewed by the TigerMed team in a way that will identify any patients directly. And so these things are very every servers are housed locally. Our TigerMed company is run by Americans. TigerMed BDM is incorporated in New Jersey since 1999, and it fully maintains full operational autonomy, according to U.S. laws and regulations. And so all of these are very I think we would from my perspective, I'm not TigerMed. They're just 30% of me, but they help me a lot, in terms of adding value to my portfolio companies. But yeah, I think even as an investor in startups, I want to make sure that all of my startups are making sure that their data is being kept and processed properly and safely, such that they're above reproach completely. And so how do we do that? I think that is up to us, and not so much for governments to tell us. I mean, they can dictate what they want, but we will continue to do what is the most ethical from my perspective. Yeah.
So as a result of this legislation in draft form now, have you personally seen some pushback or some hesitation of American companies wanting to do business in China?
I actually see a more clear bifurcation of companies. I see companies holding up their entity in the Cayman level, and then setting up a US and a China entity. And then the two basically run independently, but the shareholders at the Cayman level are the same shareholders. And then they then pursue the NMPA and the FDA clinical trials separately. But then at the end of the day, the companies that are looking at the data, the big pharma that are interested in licensing the assets, they're not going to ignore the data being generated in China. often we actually see some of the data generated in China being faster or done cheaper than in the US. And some of the big pharma companies have been asking to license the assets even before the phase 1 is done in the US, because they recognize that that data is still valuable, and the readouts are still robust. It's not, and so, but in terms of the deal, some of them have been saying, okay, we like the asset, we're giving an offer to in-license or whatever, or buyer or co-investor or whatever, but we still have to officially wait for the US trial to be done, or wait for the US data to be announced before we will proceed with an investment, maybe at the Cayman level or a cooperation at the US level. And so we see that's actually made it more expensive for some companies. But some companies have been choosing just one side of the market, just pursue the US first, get it all done in the US, and then we'll figure out the Chinese market and the Asian markets. And so, which, I think for the investors, it's made things more difficult for us and more expensive for us as we budget for how do we pursue global patients at a global market. But otherwise, I think largely our work largely remains the same.
Thank you, Emmanuel. Jing, I'll give it back to you.
Thank you, Jeff. And thank you, Emmanuel, for sharing. That's super helpful. I did see there's a question popping up, and I would love to take a first stab at it. And because this is very relevant to what we do and we're now seeing. I do see, we are actually visiting Japan and Korea a little bit later in the summer, and Taiwan as well. And we do see like there's a surging amount of activities from especially South Korea and Japan expanding their manufacturing facility, actually not only in our industry, but also in the tech industry also, like Samsung Biologics expanding their 5th factory somewhere. And they're very aggressive. If you look at the acquisition activities from, I remember there's Enjimoto doing something here as well from Japan. So definitely you see a growing number of activities from other countries. Europe, I don't hear too much, but of course, we all know that Lonza is still is huge and still very, very active and taking the lead in their R&D sector as well. Yeah, so we're happy to take it offline, just see if there's any interest in those places. We are still learning, but we're in active conversation with our business partners, as we do have investors and business partners from Korea and Japan. Mm-hmm.
So from my perspective in the government contracting world, BioSecure has a large contract with BARDA for this monoclonal antibody cocktail. And they have made it quite clear that their preference will be that when it comes time to procure this medical countermeasure for the national stockpile, that it be manufactured at a U.S. facility, despite its cost. So that's just one real-world evidence point of interest. Jin, do you have any other points that you wanted to make? If not, I have some questions I can go to.
I'm good. Please go ahead.
Okay, so what about Taiwan? Does Taiwan have any special arrangement or special consideration for, or Hong Kong for where it is? What's the difference between them?
Again, I will love to continue this conversation as there's Bio Taiwan. Another ad for Bio Taiwan this year, July 21st to 28th in Taiwan. So one of my dear friend, she's hosting, that event. Welcome to sign up and join. I probably will be there myself as well. Again, Taiwan is known, we all know TSMC, and there is a TBMC. B stands for biologics. If you go on the website, it started in late 2023, and they're actively expanding. I do have friends that are in the manufacturing space that is looking to be more aggressive in North America, that's for sure. But again, similar to Korea and Japan, we're also learning, but happy to share my 2 cents as we learn more in space.
So do you think that Japan and Korea will take up the slack if we're not allowed to do this work in China? And are they gearing up for that now?
I would say yes, from what I'm kind of witnessing what's going on, the actual facts. There's a lot of activities going on. It's very active. Yeah.
Okay. Lindsay, who do you think overall are the players that will benefit if this act goes through in its current form, and who will be harmed?
Yeah, and I think some of the industry folks probably have more insight into that than I will. But I mean, I think it's easy to say that Chinese biotech companies are generally, particularly those located in China and with ties to the Chinese government, are going to be most directly affected by it. I've talked with some of my colleagues in the in our Chinese offices, and I understand that essentially CDMO pricing has just like significantly dropped there, and folks have already, even though this law isn't in effect, and there are kind of these, potentially long, relatively long lead times on this, that there is already a lot of folks moving away. So, to the extent that they're looking for US companies looking for a project that's going to start in the next couple of years, that they're not going to China generally on it, not even just to these companies. So
that's the question. Has it infiltrated to more than just these 4 or 5 companies, to the entirety of the life science sector in China, that young startups are saying, okay, I'm about to start on a novel drug. I need someone to help me with cell line development through the process of manufacturing for my phase 1, my phase 2, my phase 3, and a commercial launch, which could take up to 10 years. And then that 2032 is a very real date.
Yeah, no, I think that is, it's going to have, for your kind of first question there, that it is affecting China generally. I understand my colleague said that the CDMO price for antibody manufacturing has crashed to about a third of the pre-pandemic pricing, and there is just significant turmoil in the market. Although he did say that he does, another CDMO that he was talking about or talking with is getting more work, because one of their competitors is on the list. And so I do think it is going to be somewhat specific, but I think China obviously as a whole is going to be affected. I think the winners are going to be non-Chinese CDMOs that are able to step in and provide these services. And whether US companies are, I think US biotech companies here in a lot of ways are going to be, depending on what services they're providing, both winners and losers in this, because there is the idea of some of this pricing may need to go up to the extent that this is not being provided in China, and you have to go elsewhere where there's higher pricing involved. That is going to affect the bottom line there. But again, to the extent that this relates to the receipt of government funding, there is an argument that, particularly for a contract, if you have a price-based contract and your price is going up as a result of this, you may actually be able to increase the value of your government contract to offset that price. So a lot of this, I think, will be really fact-specific, as you'll have some Chinese companies that are, potentially short-term winners, for the next couple of years. But there is really this idea of, without significant changes, there's going to be continued decoupling between the United States and China as a result of both US and Chinese laws that are essentially encouraging that decoupling to happen.
And do you think that will become more pervasive in terms of non-government contracts in the US? Company that is a private company that doesn't have any ties to the government, are they going to shy away from using Chinese CDMOs because of some potential legislation in the next 10 years?
Yeah, it's a real issue, and I think yes, they are. I know I do a lot of sanctions work, and so when the Russia war on Ukraine started 2 years ago, obviously significant fallout for a lot of U.S. companies that had relationships with Russia, and trying to get out and move away. And a lot of our clients since then have come to us and said, we see this something similar could happen in China. What lessons have you learned from Russia as to how we can prepare ourselves if that were, if the worst case were to happen and, there were to be kind of significant sanctions or export, even more significant export controls with regard to China in such a way that folks are looking to at least diversify, maybe not entirely withdraw, but make sure that they have, potentially a factory in Japan or Korea or, contracting partners in those countries in order to be able to, in that situation, move more of their business to, to a non-sanctioned or whatever the situation ends up being. So we do see that folks are at least starting to plan for that. Whether or not how far they'll get in those plans, it's these geopolitical issues are really hard to predict. Obviously, we have an election coming up in November, and that can also influence how things are going. So there's a lot of factors that are really up in the air, but I think most companies are looking for ways to at least have options to move away from China if they need to on an expedited basis.
Right. Jing, tell me, you, as a VC, what, in terms of your due diligence, changes or has to be more heavily scrutinized when you're looking at this potential legislation?
Yeah, thank you. This is a great question. Actually, we kind of like talk about it almost every, very often now. Actually, to make an analogy, this is not new to us because as a general tech fund, we do invest in tech companies that has been challenged or with a headwind of supply chain disruption earlier, especially that is very announced during the pandemic. That is basically hard. It's very easy to get a delay of 6 months, if not more than that. So our portfolio companies have done, some have learned or have great practice now is like a plan B, like near shore, near America, somewhere here. As we see globalization, echoing what Lindsay mentioned, is going that trend, and we do need to have like a plan B ready while we are planning out like different scenarios. So it's really like scenario planning, like weigh out the pros and cons of what might be happening and always be ready for that. So we would bring it up to say, hey, what is your plan B for that, and how much diligence have you done in that space to protect your company? But I think we have learned a lot from other industries before this happens, from the CHIPS Act, from the supply chain technologies, a lot of them emerging. I think we should be at least mentally prepared for that. Yeah, I do want to shout out that we are actively looking at companies that has novel technology to enable domestic biomanufacturing capacity, including things from a biotechnology, genetic engineering, cell line development, or autonomous in like manufacturing each single steps to make it automated, or using software and AI to boost the efficiency and increase the quality. I think that is the trend. We need to boost that capacity, not causing a ton of overhead costs, but still be able to deliver what is needed domestically.
And Emmanuel, since we still have you on the phone, do you get the sense that this may creep into other sectors like medtech or artificial intelligence or software as a medical device?
Oh, I feel like it already has in different ways, and we see it expanding. This whole concern, with the TikTok, and then actually, TikTok is so conservative; it's banned in Hong Kong. You can use TikTok in the U.S. and in China, but we were in Hong Kong, we can't access it. But yeah. I think it'll expand, but no matter what, we remain agile. And I think, the whole issue about sanctions, I mean, Hong Kong's whole history since the 1700s has been about how do we be a bridge between East and West, and how do we work around these limitations and the different difficult geopolitics around the world. And I think that's why I'm still here and in Hong Kong, and I continue to play this role of figuring out how can we continue to, through our vast minority investments and broad partnerships, really to continue to do what needs to be done. And so I'm not overly concerned, because I really think that the business will find a way, and especially when it's business involved in saving lives. So yeah. So work with our French partners. I'm happy. I really don't mind. We're investing in Japanese companies too, so that they can build up their manufacturing capability. And at the end of the day, everybody benefits, because I have shareholders who are American. I'm American, right? And
Right.
so and I'm like, we're all, the world is working together, and there's no reversing that. There's no putting the M&Ms back in order in the jar. It's you can try to say the green ones have to go here, the blue ones have to go there, but at the end of the day, you're eating M&Ms, and so people will do work that needs to be done. I remain optimistic. Thank you.
Good. Thank you for your perspective. It's excellent. We do have one more question. I think Lindsay may be able to help us with. How does the Biden administration's February executive order on protecting Americans' data interact with the BIOSECURE Act?
Yeah, that's actually a great question, because a lot of times we're presenting them together because they seem to have some overlap. In reality, they don't really. I mean, they focus on different things, and the restrictions are different, but it goes to the overall environment as to the U.S. government's focus on trying as a policy for decoupling with China when it comes to health data, genomic type issues. The executive order that came out is still it essentially, similar to the law, it directs a bunch of agencies to put in place regulations to implement it. And so there was an advance notice of proposed rulemaking that came out at this essentially the same time as the executive order, that essentially said, hey, here's what we're looking at for the scope of this. And there's the data executive order covers much more than just health or genomic data, but obviously could have a significant effect here. And so one of the things that I think folks are looking at, because one area where they're still doing a lot of consideration is how many people's data will need to be transferred for it to be restricted. And so for things like health data, whether it's going to apply to the transfer of data of 50,000 people or 1 million people, because that can have a really significant effect as to how far the impact is. And so we're really waiting to see what the final rules end up being on that, to see what the scope of it ends up being. But it certainly could, particularly to the extent with trials and things like that, where there could be an effect depending on how the data is transferred between the countries and the volume of data that's going to be transferred.
Yeah. And I just received a text in the chat from a friend of mine who works in a company here in the Maryland area, Creative Microtech, who said that they have already had a grant rejected by NIH due to unidentifiable affiliation with China based on their due diligence.
Oh, wow.
And the rejection came after they were told that their submission was most competitive. So yes,
Yeah.
This is obviously affecting young startup companies now, and people have to be mindful of it. And that's why I'm so glad that we had this opportunity to discuss it with some subject matter experts like yourselves.
Yeah, we're happy to be here. And if anyone has questions coming out of this, of course, always feel free to reach out.
So since the hour is 1, I will respectfully end our webinar. Thank Brian and Toya from the George Washington University Technology Commercialization Office for their support. Thank Lindsay and Ching and Emmanuel for joining us on today's discussion. This is also sponsored by the Society of Physician Entrepreneurs, which is really a misnomer. It's really not all about physicians. If you are a life science, med tech, high-tech entrepreneur in healthcare and life sciences, you belong in our tent. www.soapnet.org. Please join us so you can too learn about the opportunities and obstacles in bringing your innovation to life. Thank you so much for joining us.